This is urgent. If you are having doubt what is to come in 2026 concerning the nations of America, Canada, NDE Philippines, I will kindly seek you watch this video to the end. Our prayer team raised over 2,000 prayer point just few days ago unto heaven, and today's is another opportunity to lift up prayer unto heaven. Tell us where you are watching from, and if possible kindly drop your prayer request, and if you are lead, drop some words of encouragement to the next person that will watch this video. I will begin sharing today's experience. What I'm about to share with you happened just 6 days ago, and I need you to understand something from the very beginning. By military standards, what I'm about to disclose would be classified as sensitive information. But here's the critical difference. This intelligence didn't come from surveillance operations, intercepted communications, or extracted data from enemy sources. What I witnessed came directly from God Himself, and because it's already begun to unfold in real time, I have a moral obligation that supersedes any protocol or regulation. My name is Sergeant Marcus Donovan, United States Army, and I've served my country for 18 years. I'm not a media personality. I don't do podcasts or run a YouTube channel. But if everyone watching this video right now decides to share it, to like it, to spread this message across every platform available, we could save countless lives in the days ahead. I'm pleading with you. If God allowed you to see this testimony, it's not by accident. Comment below, share this with your networks, and treat what you're about to hear with the utmost urgency. This isn't entertainment. This is a warning, a prophecy, and a call to action all rolled into one. Let me give you some context about who I am and why I'm even in a position to share this. I was raised in a Christian home from a young age. My grandmother made sure we attended church every Sunday, said grace before meals, and kept a well-worn Bible on the coffee table. But if I'm being honest, for most of my life, it was just religious routine. I went through the motions, sang the hymns, bowed my head during prayers, even got baptized at 13 because that's what everyone expected. But my heart wasn't truly in it. I believed in God in an abstract, distant way, the way you might believe in gravity without thinking much about it. Everything changed after I enlisted and was deployed. I've been to Iraq twice, Afghanistan 3 times, and I've participated in classified operations in regions I'm still not authorized to disclose. When you've seen what I've seen, brothers dying in your arms, villages destroyed, children caught in crossfire, the absolute chaos and brutality of modern warfare, you come to a stark realization: there is nothing permanent in this life. We are all just passing through, temporary vessels that God uses to carry out His will and purpose. Every breath is borrowed. Every heartbeat is a gift. That understanding transformed me. I stopped going through the motions and started seeking God with genuine desperation. I dedicated my life and time to serving Him, not just my country. I studied scripture during downtime on bases. I prayed in foxholes and transport vehicles. I led Bible studies with other soldiers who were searching for meaning beyond the missions we were assigned. Anyone who's been in the military long enough understands something fundamental about our profession: we carry secrets. Not just our own, but the secrets of nations, of individuals in power, of operations that could reshape global politics if exposed. The heart of a military professional is a vault containing information that, if released improperly, could literally bring the world to its knees. We know things about weapons systems, about covert alliances, about strategic vulnerabilities that the general public will never hear about. We're trained to compartmentalize, to secure information, to understand the weight of classified intelligence. That's why what I'm about to share is so unusual for someone with my background and training. Under normal circumstances, I would never publicly disclose anything that could be considered sensitive. But what I witnessed 6 days ago didn't come from intelligence briefings or reconnaissance reports. It came directly from the throne room of God, and it's already starting to happen. When God reveals something, it ceases to be classified by human standards, it becomes a divine mandate to proclaim. I had just completed a particularly grueling 3-month deployment and was granted extended leave, 30 days of recuperation time, which is standard for personnel returning from high-stress combat zones. My commanding officer actually encouraged me to take the full leave. "Donovan," he said, "you've been running on empty for months. Take the time. Disconnect. Decompress." I decided to use the first week of my leave for a spiritual retreat. I wanted to seek God's direction for the next phase of my service, both military and spiritual. I went to a small cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, a place owned by a brother from my church who lets service members use it for free. No internet, no television, just me, my Bible, and the silence of the wilderness. I planned a 7-day fast, water only, which wasn't unusual for me. I've done multiple 3-day fasts before, even a 10-day fast once during a particularly difficult season. I know my body, know my limits, and I was confident I could handle it. The first 2 days went exactly as expected. The hunger pangs came and went. I spent hours in prayer and scripture reading, feeling God's presence in that quiet space. By the 3rd day, I was in that sweet spot where the hunger subsides and your spiritual senses seem to sharpen. I was praying on my knees in the main room, interceding for my unit, for my family, for the nation, when I suddenly felt something shift in my body. At first, I thought it was just intensified hunger, but this was different. It felt like every ounce of energy was being drained from my system simultaneously. My vision started to blur. My arms felt heavy, like they were made of lead. I told myself to push through it. I've endured far worse physical discomfort during training exercises and combat situations. Just a few more hours until you can break the fast, I thought. You've done 3 days without food countless times before. But this wasn't like those other times. I decided to step outside for fresh air, thinking maybe I just needed to move around a bit. As I stood up from my kneeling position and walked toward the cabin door, intending to check on something in the backyard, my legs suddenly gave out completely. It wasn't a gradual weakness, it was like someone flipped a switch and all power to my body was instantly cut off. I felt a massive surge of energy leave my system all at once, and I collapsed right there on the doorstep. By God's providence, my younger brother Aaron had decided to drive up to check on me. He's a paramedic in Roanoke, and he'd been worried about me fasting alone in the mountains. He was just pulling into the driveway when he saw me fall. He rushed over and immediately began assessing my vitals while shouting for his phone to call 911. His hands were checking my pulse, his voice was calling my name, but I could hear him as if from a great distance. Here's the thing that still sends chills down my spine. I saw myself lying there on those wooden steps. I was somehow above my own body, looking down at the scene like an observer. I could see Aaron pressing his fingers against my neck, searching for a pulse. I could see the panic in his eyes. I could see my own face, pale and lifeless, and I remember thinking, that's me down there. I'm watching them try to save me. Then the scene changed. Suddenly, I wasn't at the cabin anymore. I was standing in what appeared to be a vast field, and the ground beneath my feet was covered with mushrooms. But these weren't ordinary mushrooms, each one was massive, roughly the size of my open palm, and as I looked closer, I realized they weren't just random growths. Each mushroom was shaped like the geographical outline of a country. My military training kicked in immediately. I've studied countless maps throughout my career, briefing maps, tactical maps, satellite imagery of virtually every region on Earth. Map recognition is second nature to me, and as I examined these mushroom formations, I could identify them easily. There was the distinctive outline of the United States, the elongated shape of Chile, the boot of Italy, the sprawling mass of Russia. Dozens of countries were represented in these strange fungal formations, spread across this mysterious field. But I won't lie, there were some mushroom maps I couldn't identify. Some were small island nations or obscure territories I'd never studied in detail. Still, the majority were clearly recognizable to anyone with basic geographical knowledge. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, I noticed movement. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I saw them clearly, what looked like soldier ants, thousands upon thousands of them, emerging from cracks in the ground. They moved with disturbing precision, like a military unit executing a coordinated assault. They marched in perfect formation toward one specific target, the mushroom shaped like the United States of America. Within seconds, they swarmed over it. I watched in horror as they devoured the American mushroom, consuming it so completely that nothing remained but bare earth. Then, with the same mechanical efficiency, they pivoted and marched toward the mushroom shaped like Canada. Same result, total consumption. Then the Philippines. Then one after another, they moved through the field, devouring nation after nation with terrifying speed and coordination. When the feeding frenzy finally stopped, only a handful of mushroom nations remained standing. I noticed that where each consumed mushroom had been, there was now a scroll lying on the ground, perfectly positioned where the nation's capital would have been on a real map. I don't know what compelled me, but I felt drawn to pick up the scroll where the United States mushroom had stood. My hand reached for it automatically, though something in my spirit told me this was incredibly significant. After picking up the American scroll, I gathered several others: Canada, the Philippines, South Africa, and a few more. I can't explain why I chose those particular ones, only that I felt directed to do so. The scroll for the United States was made of what appeared to be aged parchment, and written at the top in bold script was simply 2026. It was positioned almost like a signature or a date stamp, authenticating what was about to be revealed. As I unrolled the scroll, something extraordinary happened. The parchment dissolved, and suddenly I was watching events unfold before my eyes like scenes from a movie, except these were hyper-realistic, more vivid than any film I'd ever seen. I was watching the future, specifically, what awaits the United States of America in 2026. The first thing I witnessed was massive, unprecedented weather anomalies across America. I saw all 4 seasons: spring, summer, fall, and winter, but each one was extreme beyond anything in recorded history. These weren't normal seasonal variations. They were apocalyptic in scale. I watched spring arrive with torrential rainfall unlike anything meteorologists had prepared for. The vision showed me late March through early June, and the rain was relentless. Not occasional storms, but weeks of continuous precipitation that transformed the American landscape into something unrecognizable. The entire Mississippi River basin became essentially one enormous flood zone. I saw water levels rising so rapidly that evacuation orders couldn't be issued fast enough. The mighty Mississippi, which already floods periodically, swelled to widths of 20, 30, even 40 miles in some stretches. Towns that had stood along its banks for 2 centuries were completely submerged, not just flooded, but erased from the landscape as if they had never existed. States like Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Missouri, and Illinois were underwater. Not just the low-lying areas, entire cities were submerged. I watched Baton Rouge disappear beneath 15 feet of water. Memphis became an island, accessible only by helicopter. St. Louis saw the Gateway Arch standing in what looked like an inland sea. The casinos and hotels along the Gulf Coast were swept away like matchsticks. I saw Interstate 55 become a river, with abandoned vehicles floating like toys in a bathtub. Interstate 40 was severed in multiple locations as bridges collapsed under the pressure of raging floodwaters. The transportation infrastructure of the central United States was effectively destroyed, cutting the nation in 2 and making relief efforts nearly impossible. The flooding wasn't confined to the traditional flood zones. I saw flash floods in mountain communities in Tennessee and Kentucky that had never experienced such devastation. Entire valleys in Appalachia became lakes overnight. Small towns nestled in hollows were buried under walls of water and mud that came down from the mountains with such force that buildings were ripped from their foundations. Mudslides buried entire neighborhoods in West Virginia. I watched as mountainsides that had been destabilized by heavy rain simply gave way, sending millions of tons of earth, trees, and debris down onto communities below. Mining towns that had weathered decades of economic decline were finally obliterated by forces of nature they couldn't fight. The infrastructure damage was catastrophic. Bridges collapsed, levees failed, water treatment plants were destroyed. I saw the Bonnet Car spillway in Louisiana completely overwhelmed, unable to divert enough water to protect New Orleans. The city's pump systems, already ancient and barely adequate, failed completely. The lower Ninth Ward flooded again, but this time the entire city went with it. The French Quarter, that historic jewel of American culture, was submerged. Dams that had been built during the New Deal era, now nearly a century old, began to fail under unprecedented pressure. I watched as the Barkley Dam on the Cumberland River developed cracks that turned into catastrophic breaches. When it failed, the wall of water that roared downstream wiped out everything in its path for over 100 miles. Agricultural losses were staggering. The American breadbasket, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, saw entire seasons of crops destroyed. Fields that should have been planted in April and May were still underwater in June. Livestock drowned by the hundreds of thousands. Grain silos burst as water-soaked grain expanded. The economic impact on food production would echo throughout the year and into the next. The human cost was beyond calculation. I saw families trapped on rooftops, waiting for rescue that in many cases never came because there simply weren't enough helicopters, enough boats, enough rescuers. Elderly residents in nursing homes perished as facilities lost power and water rose faster than evacuation could be coordinated. Children were separated from parents in the chaos of sudden evacuations. Refugee camps were established in every dry area within 1,000 miles of the disaster zone. High school gymnasiums in Texas housed families from Louisiana. College dormitories in Tennessee sheltered evacuees from Arkansas. Every church, community center, and public building became an emergency shelter, but there simply wasn't enough capacity for the millions displaced. Disease began to spread in the stagnant floodwaters. Cholera outbreaks appeared for the first time in the United States in over a century. Mosquito-borne illnesses exploded as trillions of the insects bred in standing water that covered thousands of square miles. Medical systems were overwhelmed treating waterborne illnesses, infections from contaminated water, and injuries sustained during the disaster. Then summer arrived, and with it came heat unlike anything in American history. I'm not talking about uncomfortable hot days, I'm talking about sustained temperatures that made large portions of the country virtually uninhabitable. The Southwest became a furnace. The vision showed me June through September, and what I witnessed was terrifying. Cities like Phoenix, Las Vegas, Tucson, and Palm Springs recorded temperatures exceeding 130 degrees Fahrenheit for days, sometimes weeks at a time. The heat wasn't just a daytime phenomenon. Nighttime temperatures remained above 100 degrees, giving no relief and no opportunity for buildings and infrastructure to cool down. People died in their homes despite running air conditioning at full capacity. The electrical grid couldn't handle the load. Every home, every business, every building running AC units at maximum created demand that exceeded supply by catastrophic margins. The grid didn't just experience brownouts, entire sections collapsed completely. When power went out in 115-degree heat, homes became ovens within hours. I watched as vulnerable populations, elderly, sick, young children, perished in the heat. Nursing homes lost power and became death traps. Hospitals struggled to keep critical systems running. Emergency rooms were overwhelmed with heat stroke cases, dehydration, and heat-related cardiac events. Morgues ran out of capacity, forcing authorities to establish temporary facilities in refrigerated trucks, but even those were insufficient. The heat created additional cascading failures. Asphalt roads literally melted, becoming soft and sticky, making them impassable. I saw sections of Interstate 10 across Arizona where the pavement had warped and buckled, creating waves in the highway that made it unusable. Airport runways suffered similar damage, grounding flights. Railroad tracks warped under the heat, derailing trains. Water systems failed as treatment plants lost power and pipes burst from thermal stress. Reservoirs dropped to historic lows as evaporation accelerated and demand soared. Lake Mead, already dangerously low, dropped to dead pool status, meaning it could no longer generate hydroelectric power or supply water to downstream users. Las Vegas faced the real possibility of complete abandonment. In Death Valley, temperatures reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature at which human survival becomes impossible even with water. The Mojave Desert became genuinely lethal. Entire ecosystems collapsed as plants and animals that had adapted to extreme heat still couldn't survive this new reality. But the heat wasn't contained to the desert Southwest. I saw unprecedented temperatures spreading across the Great Plains and even into the Midwest. Oklahoma City recorded 125-degree temperatures. Dallas endured weeks of 120-degree heat. Even Chicago, known for harsh winters, experienced sustained periods above 110 degrees, temperatures for which its infrastructure was completely unprepared. The economic impact was immediate and severe. Outdoor work became impossible during daylight hours. Construction stopped. Agriculture suffered catastrophic losses as crops literally cooked in the fields. Cattle died by the hundreds of thousands, collapsing from heat stress. Chicken farms lost entire flocks when ventilation systems failed during power outages. But the heat wasn't the only summer catastrophe. I watched massive wildfires erupt across the western states with unprecedented fury. California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, entire regions became infernos. These weren't isolated brush fires that could be contained. The combination of extreme heat, years of drought intensified by climate change, and heavy fuel loads created conditions for megafires unlike anything in American history. I saw walls of flame hundreds of feet high, moving faster than evacuation vehicles could drive. The fires created their own weather systems, with pyrocumulus clouds generating lightning that sparked new fires miles ahead of the main blaze. Northern California's forests became a hellscape. The Sierra Nevada mountains were engulfed in flames that burned so hot they incinerated everything in their path, not just vegetation, but soil, rock, everything. Towns scattered through the mountains were obliterated. Paradise, California, which had been destroyed by fire before, was burned again, along with dozens of other communities. Southern California faced similar devastation. The wildland-urban interface, that zone where homes meet wilderness, became a death trap. Entire subdivisions in San Diego County were consumed in minutes as fires raced down canyons pushed by Santa Ana winds. Malibu burned completely. Communities in the San Bernardino Mountains were incinerated. Oregon and Washington suffered equally. The Cascade Range became a wall of fire. Portland was surrounded by flames on 3 sides. Seattle faced fires approaching from the east. Entire national forests, the Gifford-Pinchot, the Mount Hood, the Olympic, burned with such intensity that fire suppression efforts were abandoned. There was simply no stopping fires of this magnitude. I watched as firefighting resources were completely overwhelmed. Every firefighter in the western states was deployed, along with National Guard units, military personnel, and international teams from Canada, Mexico, Australia, and New Zealand. Despite these massive efforts, the fires continued to spread. Aircraft dropping retardant and water made no appreciable difference against fires that were generating their own wind systems. Entire towns were evacuated with only minutes of warning. I saw highways clogged with fleeing residents as walls of flame approached from multiple directions. Some evacuations succeeded. Others didn't. Vehicles were found later, burned to shells with the remains of families who had tried to escape but were overtaken by the incredible speed of the fires. The smoke from these fires was so dense that it created its own weather systems and had effects across the entire continent. I watched as cities like Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco were plunged into darkness at noon, the sun completely blocked by smoke that hung in the air for weeks. Air quality reached hazardous levels, not just in the West, but across the entire United States as smoke drifted east. People with asthma, COPD, and other respiratory conditions suffered acute crises. Emergency rooms were filled with people who couldn't breathe. Children and elderly were particularly vulnerable. Schools closed across multiple states because outdoor air was too dangerous for children. The smoke reached the East Coast, turning skies orange in New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. Air quality alerts were issued from Seattle to Miami. For weeks, the entire nation was living under a blanket of toxic smoke. People couldn't go outside without N95 masks, and even then, the air quality was hazardous. The environmental devastation was almost incomprehensible. Millions of acres of forest were destroyed, not just burned, but completely incinerated, with soil burned so thoroughly that recovery would take centuries. Wildlife was decimated. Endangered species were pushed to extinction. Watersheds were destroyed, meaning even when rain eventually came, the water would be contaminated with ash and debris. The aftermath of summer brought fall, but there was no relief. Instead, I witnessed hurricane activity that defied every model and prediction. The Atlantic hurricane season, typically running from June through November, exploded with unprecedented intensity. Storms formed with terrifying speed and reached Category 5 status while still hundreds of miles from land. The warm ocean temperatures, exacerbated by climate change, provided rocket fuel for hurricanes. I watched as storms that meteorologists expected to be Category 2 or 3 at landfall instead maintained or even intensified to Category 5 as they approached the coast. The Gulf Coast was hit repeatedly. Hurricane after hurricane slammed into Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida with devastating frequency. There was no time to recover between storms. Debris from one hurricane was still being cleared when the next one arrived. Buildings that had been damaged but remained standing after the first storm were destroyed by the second or third. Florida was hit hardest. I watched as Tampa, which had long been identified as one of the most vulnerable major cities to hurricane storm surge, finally experienced the catastrophe that had been predicted for decades. A Category 5 hurricane with sustained winds of 175 miles per hour made direct landfall on Tampa Bay. The storm surge was over 20 feet, flooding downtown Tampa, St. Petersburg, and Clearwater to depths that submerged first floors of buildings. Miami faced similar devastation. Multiple hurricanes struck South Florida, each bringing catastrophic storm surge, devastating winds, and torrential rain. The entire southern tip of the peninsula was underwater. The Florida Keys were swept clean. Buildings, roads, infrastructure, all gone. Key West, that historic outpost, was erased. Jacksonville, on Florida's Atlantic coast, was struck by a hurricane that intensified rapidly just before landfall. The St. Johns River, which flows north and is vulnerable to storm surge, pushed seawater miles inland, flooding neighborhoods that had never experienced such inundation. The damage to naval facilities at Mayport was severe. Pensacola and the Panhandle, still recovering from previous hurricanes, were hit again. The repeated battering was too much. Many residents simply gave up, abandoning their homes and moving north. Entire coastal communities became ghost towns. But it wasn't just Florida. I saw hurricanes maintain their strength far inland, devastating states that rarely face such threats. A hurricane that made landfall near New Orleans maintained Category 3 strength all the way to Memphis, over 400 miles inland. The destruction across Mississippi, Tennessee, and into Kentucky was catastrophic. Georgia experienced hurricane-force winds that destroyed Atlanta's urban forest. Millions of trees fell, crushing homes, blocking roads, and downing power lines. The city was without power for weeks. Savannah, on the coast, faced storm surge that flooded the entire historic district. Buildings that had stood for over 200 years were damaged beyond repair. South Carolina's coast was battered repeatedly. Charleston, with its low-lying historic downtown, was flooded to depths of 6 to 8 feet during multiple hurricanes. The historic battery was destroyed. Rainbow Row, those iconic colorful homes, were severely damaged. The economic impact on tourism, the region's primary industry, was devastating. North Carolina's Outer Banks, those barrier islands that have protected the mainland for millennia, was simply overwhelmed. Hatteras Island was cut in multiple places, creating new inlets. Ocracoke was abandoned after being flooded 3 times in 2 months. The Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, which had been moved inland years ago to protect it from erosion, was threatened again. Even Virginia faced unprecedented hurricane impacts. Norfolk, home to the world's largest naval base, experienced storm surge that flooded the base and damaged or destroyed numerous naval vessels. The economic and military implications were staggering. The hurricanes brought not just wind and storm surge, but unprecedented rainfall. I watched as storms that had made landfall stalled over populated areas, dumping 30, 40, even 50 inches of rain. The flooding from these rainfall events was as devastating as the storm surge. The cumulative effect of multiple hurricanes in a single season was catastrophic. Insurance companies, already stretched thin from the spring flooding and summer wildfires, began to collapse. Many simply declared bankruptcy, unable to pay claims. Homeowners who had dutifully paid insurance premiums for decades discovered their policies were worthless. The economic impact on the affected states was ruinous. Property values collapsed. Businesses closed permanently. Tourism, crucial to many coastal economies, disappeared as potential visitors feared another storm. Population began to shift as climate refugees moved inland, abandoning coastal areas that had become uninsurable and uninhabitable. Then winter arrived, and with it came cold and snow that paralyzed the nation. I watched as Arctic air masses plunged deep into the United States, bringing temperatures that broke records not by small margins but by shocking amounts. The cold snap began in early December and persisted through February with barely any break. Cities in Texas that rarely see freezing temperatures experience sustained periods of sub-zero cold. Dallas recorded temperatures of -15 degrees Fahrenheit. Houston, a city where snow is a rarity, saw -5 degrees Fahrenheit. Austin experienced 2 weeks of temperatures that never rose above 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The power grid in Texas, which had nearly collapsed during a cold snap years earlier, failed completely this time. The state's isolated grid, not connected to neighboring regions for political reasons, couldn't import power when generation failed. Natural gas supplies froze. Wind turbines iced over. Solar panels were covered with snow and ice. Coal plants, already operating at the edge of their capacity, broke down under the extreme cold. When the power failed, the tragedy unfolded rapidly. Homes designed for hot weather, with poor insulation and no alternative heating sources, became freezers. Families huddled together for warmth, burning furniture and books in fireplaces not designed for such use. House fires increased dramatically as people used dangerous methods to stay warm. Carbon monoxide poisoning from improper use of generators and heaters killed hundreds. People froze to death in their homes. The elderly living alone were found days after they died, frozen in their beds or chairs. Homeless populations in cities like Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio suffered massive casualties. Shelters were overwhelmed and couldn't accommodate everyone seeking refuge from the cold. Water systems failed catastrophically. Pipes burst by the millions as water inside froze and expanded. When the thaw finally came, the flooding from broken pipes was almost as bad as the original cold. Entire neighborhoods were flooded not from snow or rain, but from water mains and service lines that had shattered. The cold wasn't contained to Texas. I saw unprecedented temperatures spreading across the South. Atlanta experienced -10 degrees Fahrenheit. Birmingham recorded -15 degrees Fahrenheit. New Orleans, that subtropical city, saw temperatures drop to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, killing people who had no experience with such conditions and no proper clothing or heating. Further north, cities accustomed to harsh winters experienced cold that exceeded even their worst historical records. Chicago endured weeks of temperatures below -30 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chills reaching -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Minneapolis saw -50 degrees Fahrenheit actual temperatures. Even these cold-adapted cities struggled as the extreme conditions persisted far longer than any previous cold snap. The snow was equally catastrophic. I saw blizzards dump 6, 7, 8 feet of snow in single storms. Buffalo, which holds the record for extreme lake effect snow, received over 15 feet in one storm event. The city was completely buried. Buildings collapsed under the weight of snow. Roads were impassable for weeks. Cities like Denver, Minneapolis, Chicago, Boston, and even New York, places with sophisticated snow removal infrastructure, were completely paralyzed. Highways became death traps as vehicles were buried. I saw Interstate 90 across South Dakota and Wyoming closed for over a month, with hundreds of vehicles trapped on the roadway, some with people still inside when they were finally reached. Roofs collapsed by the thousands under the weight of accumulated snow. Shopping malls, warehouses, factories, schools, structures that had stood for decades gave way under unprecedented snow loads. People were trapped in their homes for weeks, unable to open doors blocked by snow drifts that were 12 to 15 feet high. Food supplies ran short as delivery trucks couldn't navigate roads. Grocery store shelves emptied and stayed empty for weeks. People trapped in rural areas ran out of food and had no way to reach stores even if they had been stocked. Medical emergencies couldn't be responded to because ambulances couldn't get through the snow. The National Guard was deployed across dozens of states to conduct search and rescue operations, deliver food and medicine, and attempt to clear critical roadways. But even military vehicles struggled with the depth of snow. Helicopters became the primary means of reaching stranded populations, but weather conditions often prevented flight operations. The economic disruption was total. Businesses closed because employees couldn't reach work. Supply chains broke down completely. Manufacturing stopped. Retail was decimated. The stock market plunged as investors realized the scale of the economic catastrophe unfolding. What disturbed me most about these weather events wasn't just their individual severity, It was their cumulative effect and the fact that they followed one after another with no time for recovery. Spring flooding destroyed infrastructure that wasn't rebuilt before summer fires raged. Fire-devastated regions were then hit by fall hurricanes. And communities still recovering from hurricanes were then paralyzed by winter cold and snow. Each season brought its own disaster, and the nation never had time to recover before the next catastrophe struck. The federal government's emergency response capabilities were stretched beyond breaking. FEMA, designed to handle regional disasters, faced simultaneous catastrophes across the entire nation. Resources were completely exhausted. Personnel worked to the point of collapse. The financial cost exceeded the entire annual federal budget. The National Guard was deployed continuously, with soldiers serving on emergency response duty for months without relief. Active military forces were diverted from their primary missions to provide disaster relief. The military's logistics capabilities, the best in the world, were barely adequate to the task of keeping American citizens supplied with food, water, and medicine. State governments were overwhelmed. Governors declared states of emergency that remained in effect for the entire year. State budgets, already strained by the costs of disaster response, collapsed. Many states faced bankruptcy. Essential services were cut. Schools closed not just for days or weeks, but for months. The education of an entire generation of American children was disrupted. I saw international aid pouring into America, a reversal that shocked many Americans who were accustomed to their nation being the helper rather than the helped. Nations that America had traditionally supported during disasters were now sending support to us. Medical teams from European countries arrived to support overwhelmed American hospitals. Emergency supplies came from Asia. Technical expertise from around the world was offered and gratefully accepted. Despite this global response, the destruction was so massive that recovery seemed impossible. Infrastructure that had taken decades to build was destroyed in weeks. Bridges that had stood for a century were gone. Power grids were shattered. Water systems were ruined. Transportation networks were severed. The rebuilding task would take decades and cost trillions. Entire industries collapsed. Agriculture suffered losses that threatened food security. Energy production was disrupted, leading to shortages and price spikes. Manufacturing ground to a halt as supply chains broke and facilities were damaged or destroyed. The tourism industry evaporated as potential visitors saw images of a nation in crisis. The human displacement was staggering. Estimates reached over 30 million Americans who became climate refugees within their own country. These weren't temporary evacuations, these were permanent relocations. People fled from flood zones that would never be rebuilt, from coastal areas that were no longer insurable, from regions where infrastructure had been so thoroughly destroyed that modern life was no longer possible. These refugees fled from one disaster zone only to land in another. People who evacuated from spring floods in Louisiana ended up in Texas, only to face summer heat and winter freezes. Those who fled California wildfires to Oregon found themselves facing more fires. Hurricane evacuees from Florida moved to North Carolina, only to be hit by hurricanes there as well. The social fabric began to tear under the strain. Communities that had existed for generations simply ceased to exist. The bonds of civil society weakened as survival became the primary concern. Crime increased as desperate people took desperate measures. There were reports of looting, violence, and social breakdown in some affected areas, though these remained isolated incidents rather than widespread chaos. But through it all, I saw something else. I saw Americans pulling together in ways that hadn't been seen since World War II. Neighbors helping neighbors without being asked. Churches opening their doors as shelters and feeding stations. Regular citizens becoming first responders, organizing relief efforts, sharing resources. In the midst of chaos, there was also courage, compassion, and resilience. I watched as people who had lost everything still found ways to help others. A family in Houston that had frozen in their powerless home during the winter cold opened a community warming center the following year. A farmer in Iowa who lost his entire crop to flooding still donated what food he had stored to disaster victims. A firefighter in California who lost his own home to wildfire continued fighting fires to save others' homes. Communities discovered strength they didn't know they had. Small towns that were isolated by snow worked together to share food and heating fuel. Neighborhoods devastated by hurricanes organized collective rebuilding efforts. Cities struggling with heat waves opened cooling centers in every available building and checked on vulnerable residents. The disasters, while revealing weakness in infrastructure and institutions, also revealed the fundamental strength of the American people, their capacity for mutual aid, their willingness to sacrifice for others, their determination to rebuild and persist in the face of overwhelming odds. As the vision of weather catastrophes faded, the scroll revealed something else, something that would shake the foundations of American Christianity and send shockwaves throughout the global church. I saw massive exposure and disclosure of hidden secrets involving prominent American pastors and televangelists. We're not talking about minor indiscretions or theological disagreements. These were major moral, financial, and spiritual failures that had been concealed for years, sometimes decades. The vision showed me specifically 9 American religious leaders who would be publicly exposed in 2026. These weren't small-time preachers, these were household names, men who led megachurches with congregations numbering in the tens of thousands, who appeared regularly on television networks reaching millions, whose books sold by the millions of copies and topped bestseller lists, who advised presidents and counseled celebrities and were invited to speak at national events. Their influence extended far beyond their local congregations into national culture and politics. Their falls from grace would be spectacular and devastating. I watched as investigations uncovered what they thought no one would ever see. The mechanisms of exposure were varied. Some came through whistleblowers who could no longer remain silent, others through forensic investigations prompted by anonymous tips, still others through supernatural revelation that directed investigators to look in specific places for specific evidence. The first category of exposure involved sexual scandals, not isolated incidents that could be explained away as momentary weakness, but patterns of abuse and exploitation that had been systematically covered up by layers of institutional protection. I saw evidence emerge of long-term affairs conducted while these men preached about the sanctity of marriage and family values. Private investigators uncovered photographic and video evidence. Digital trails revealed communications that proved premeditation and systematic deception. Hotel records, credit card statements, private messages, all of it came flooding out into public view. What made these revelations particularly devastating was the pattern of institutional cover-up. I watched as evidence emerged showing that church boards, denominational leaders, and even legal teams had known about these behaviors for years and had actively worked to conceal them. Victims who had tried to speak up were paid off, intimidated into silence, or discredited through coordinated campaigns of character assassination. Non-disclosure agreements were weaponized to protect predators rather than victims. The financial corruption formed the second wave of exposure, and it was staggering in scope. I saw forensic accountants tracing money flows from charitable donations and tithes into personal accounts, luxury purchases, and offshore holdings. Private jets purchased through ministry funds but used almost exclusively for family vacations. Multiple mansions in different states registered under shell corporations but occupied by the pastors and their families. Exotic vehicle collections valued in the millions. Designer wardrobes that cost more than most of their congregants earned in a year. One particularly egregious case involved a televangelist who had raised over $50 million for mission work in Africa but had diverted more than 80% of those funds to personal use. The missions that did receive funding were essentially elaborate photo opportunities, carefully staged visits to orphanages and water projects, documented extensively for fundraising purposes, but with minimal actual impact or follow-through. Meanwhile, luxury properties in the Caribbean and Europe were purchased with donor funds, justified through convoluted explanations about ministry needs and strategic locations for evangelism. The money laundering schemes were sophisticated, involving layers of shell corporations, international transfers through multiple jurisdictions, and complex trust structures designed to obscure ownership and control. But investigative journalists working with financial crime experts unraveled it all. Tax returns showed minimal personal income while these leaders lived like billionaires. The mathematics didn't add up, and once authorities began investigating, the entire house of cards collapsed. Criminal indictments followed. Federal prosecutors brought charges of wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, and violation of charitable organization statutes. Some of these leaders attempted to flee the country, only to be arrested at airports. Others held press conferences proclaiming their innocence and claiming persecution, but the evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Bank records don't lie. Financial transactions leave digital footprints that can't be erased. But perhaps most disturbing was the third category of exposure: involvement with dark spiritual practices and secret societies. I watched as evidence emerged of prominent pastors who had been living double lives, publicly preaching Christ while privately involved with Freemasonry, occult practices, and other secret organizations that directly contradict Christian faith. Leaked photographs showed these men participating in Masonic initiation ceremonies, wearing regalia that bore symbols incompatible with Christian faith. Video footage emerged from closed-door meetings where Luciferian doctrines were discussed openly. Ritual participation was documented, ceremonies invoking entities and powers that had nothing to do with the God of the Bible. Personal libraries were revealed containing extensive collections of occult literature, grimoires, and texts on dark magic, many with handwritten notes indicating serious study and application. One particular revelation showed a prominent pastor who had built a ministry empire on deliverance and spiritual warfare while secretly practicing the very dark arts he claimed to oppose. His private journals, leaked by a former assistant who could no longer bear the deception, detailed years of involvement in occult practices. He had been using spiritual knowledge gained through dark sources to manipulate his congregation, creating dependencies and control structures that looked like spiritual authority but were actually spiritual bondage. I saw evidence emerge of connections to Illuminati-associated groups and other shadowy organizations. Private meetings were documented where these religious leaders gathered with political figures, business moguls, and entertainment industry executives in settings that had nothing to do with Christian fellowship. The agenda of these gatherings was the consolidation of power and influence through coordinated messaging and mutual protection. They had formed, essentially, a shadow church that operated according to principles antithetical to the gospel while maintaining a public facade of Christian orthodoxy. Sermon content was revealed to have been deliberately crafted to subtly shift theological positions over time, leading congregations away from biblical truth while maintaining the appearance of orthodox Christianity. Analysis of decades of preaching showed a systematic progression. Early sermons were relatively sound, establishing credibility, but gradually the message shifted. Core doctrines were undermined through clever reinterpretation. The authority of Scripture was subtly questioned. The exclusivity of Christ was softened to accommodate interfaith dialogue that ultimately denied fundamental Christian claims. The existence of hell was minimized or reframed as metaphorical. Sin was redefined as merely dysfunction or social construction rather than rebellion against God. The manipulation was sophisticated and long-term, designed to gradually erode foundational doctrines while keeping people engaged and emotionally connected. These leaders understood psychological manipulation, crowd dynamics, and the power of incremental change. They knew that if they moved slowly enough, most people wouldn't notice that the Christianity they were hearing bore little resemblance to the faith once delivered to the saints. I also saw exposure of deliberate doctrinal heresies promoted for personal gain. The prosperity gospel, that teaching which promises wealth and health to all believers who have enough faith and give enough money, was revealed to be a knowing scam in several prominent cases. Private communications showed these leaders laughing about the gullibility of their followers. They preached prosperity when they knew Scripture taught contentment. They promised health and wealth when they understood that Jesus promised tribulation. They built empires on false promises, selling hope like a commodity while creating dependency and despair. Some had gone even further into heresy, promoting teachings that directly contradicted the gospel. Universalism, the idea that all people will eventually be saved regardless of their faith in Christ, was being taught subtly from pulpits where the leaders themselves didn't believe in any form of salvation at all. They were atheists in robes, nihilists with theological degrees, shepherding flocks toward nothing while enriching themselves in the process. The impact of these exposures was seismic. Churches that had been built over decades collapsed almost overnight. I watched as congregations of 20, 30, even 50,000 people dwindled to a few hundred or disappeared entirely within weeks of the revelations. Buildings that had hosted packed services now sat empty, massive monuments to false shepherds and misplaced trust. Denominations fractured as they grappled with the revelation that their most prominent leaders had been wolves in shepherd's clothing. Long-standing partnerships dissolved. Conferences were cancelled. Publishing houses that had promoted these leaders' books now faced lawsuits from readers who felt defrauded. Christian television networks scrambled to fill programming hours after pulling content from disgraced ministers. The entire infrastructure that had supported celebrity Christianity began to crumble. The scandal dominated news cycles for months, becoming international news as the scope of the deception became clear. Secular media outlets, often dismissive of religion, now gave extensive coverage to these Christian scandals, and the tone was merciless. Late-night comedians made these fallen pastors the subjects of monologues night after night. News anchors who rarely covered religious topics now led with these stories. The name of Christ was mocked in the public square because those who had claimed to represent him had betrayed everything he stood for. Millions of believers walked away from organized religion entirely, their faith shattered by the hypocrisy they witnessed. If these great men of God were frauds, they reasoned, then maybe it's all a fraud. The logic was understandable even if flawed. If those who seemed most spiritual, most anointed, most blessed by God were actually charlatans, how could anyone trust any religious leader or institution? The exodus from churches was devastating, and not just from the ministries directly involved in scandal. Attendance dropped across the board as people questioned everything they'd been taught. Communities lost their moral and social anchors. Churches that had been centers of community life, providing social services, hosting recovery programs, running food banks and counseling centers, had to close their doors due to lack of funding and participation. The collateral damage extended far beyond the guilty parties to affect innocent ministries and faithful pastors who had been faithfully serving their communities for years. Financial giving to Christian causes plummeted as donors became suspicious of all religious organizations. Legitimate missions and charities suffered alongside the fraudulent ones. Missionaries had to leave their fields of service and return home because support had dried up. Orphanages and schools that had been funded by American Christians faced closure. The ripple effects of broken trust spread around the world. The psychological and spiritual damage to individuals was profound. People who had given decades of their lives to these ministries, who had volunteered countless hours, who had given sacrificially from limited resources, felt personally betrayed. Depression and disillusionment were epidemic among former members of these churches. Some experienced full crisis of faith, questioning not just religious leaders but the existence of God himself. Marriages that had been held together by shared faith came apart when that foundation cracked. Families fractured along lines of who still believed and who had abandoned faith entirely. Suicide rates increased among those most deeply invested in these ministries. Former staff members and key volunteers struggled with guilt, wondering how they had failed to see the truth, or worse, wondering if they had been complicit in the deception. The mental health crisis within the Christian community became a serious concern, requiring coordinated response from counselors and therapists. But here's what I also saw, and this is crucial: the exposure, while painful, was ultimately redemptive. It was a necessary purification, burning away the dross so that pure gold could remain. God was cleaning his house, removing those who had corrupted his message and exploited his people. It was severe mercy, harsh but healing. The false had to be exposed so the true could be recognized. The counterfeit had to be revealed so the genuine could be valued. The corrupt had to be removed so the faithful could be honored. This wasn't the end of Christianity in America, it was the refining of it. I watched as a remnant began to emerge from the wreckage. These were believers who had always been uncomfortable with celebrity Christianity, who had questioned the prosperity gospel, who had maintained simple faith in Christ despite the circus that much of American Christianity had become. They had been overshadowed by the megachurch phenomenon, dismissed as unsophisticated or lacking vision, but now their faithfulness was vindicated. Small churches that had quietly served their communities for generations without seeking spotlight or fame suddenly found themselves full of people seeking authenticity. House churches multiplied as believers gathered in living rooms for simple worship, Bible study, and genuine fellowship. Prison ministries, homeless outreaches, recovery programs, Unglamorous works that had been faithfully maintained by unknown saints now received attention and support. A new generation of leaders began to emerge, marked not by charisma or entrepreneurial skill but by character and servanthood. These were men and women who had been tested through suffering, who had maintained integrity in obscurity, who loved Jesus more than they loved ministry success. They led by example rather than by rhetoric. They served rather than being served. They pointed people to Christ rather than building their own brands. By September 2026, something remarkable began to happen. The very scandal that had driven people away from church became a catalyst for genuine spiritual hunger. The vacuum created by the collapse of institutional religion became space for the Holy Spirit to move. People who had been disillusioned by organized religion began seeking authentic encounters with God, not through programs or personalities, but through humble prayer and honest seeking. Prayer meetings spontaneously erupted across the nation, not organized by denominations or promoted by famous preachers, but grassroots gatherings of ordinary believers desperate for truth. A businessman in Ohio started meeting with 3 friends in his living room to pray for the nation. Within weeks, 30 people were gathering. Within months, 300. Similar stories played out in cities and towns across America, unofficial, unplanned, organic movements of prayer. I watched as this prayer movement grew into something unprecedented. Millions of Americans, from every background and tradition, fell to their knees in genuine repentance and intercession. Catholic and Protestant prayed together. Charismatic and Reformed worshipped side by side. Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, denominational and racial barriers that had divided the church for centuries began to dissolve in the heat of genuine spiritual hunger. They prayed for the nation, for healing of the land and restoration of righteousness. They prayed for the church, confessing the sins of pride, greed, and compromise that had led to such corruption. They prayed for the victims of these scandals, for their healing and restoration. They prayed for wisdom and discernment, asking God to help His people distinguish truth from error, authentic from counterfeit. And God answered. A revival ignited that was unlike anything in American history, not because of charismatic personalities or slick production, but because of broken hearts genuinely seeking God. There were no celebrity preachers promoting it, no merchandise being sold, no conferences to attend. It was raw, authentic, and powerful precisely because it was devoid of human marketing and manipulation. It started in living rooms and moved to public squares. College campuses saw spontaneous worship gatherings where students would gather between classes to pray and sing. Professional athletes knelt in prayer before games, not as performance but as genuine dependence on God. Business leaders held Bible studies in corporate offices, bringing faith into spaces it had been excluded from. Teachers prayed with students. Doctors prayed with patients. The sacred-secular divide that had compartmentalized faith began to break down. The impact reached into government. Politicians who had used faith as a political tool, treating Christianity as a voting bloc to be manipulated, found themselves genuinely convicted of their hypocrisy. Some publicly repented, acknowledging they had dishonored God by invoking His name while pursuing ungodly policies. Others quietly changed their behavior, allowing actual conviction rather than political calculation to guide their decisions. Policy discussions began to reflect authentic Christian values rather than politically expedient positions. Laws were proposed and passed that reflected mercy and justice rather than partisan advantage. Immigration reform that honored both the rule of law and the biblical mandate to welcome strangers. Criminal justice reform that balanced accountability with redemption. Economic policies that recognized both personal responsibility and communal obligation. The political discourse, while still contentious, became more substantive and less performative. The media, which had gleefully covered the scandals of fallen pastors with barely concealed delight, found themselves unable to ignore the genuine transformation happening across the country. Reporters assigned to cover prayer meetings expecting to find more hypocrisy instead encountered something they couldn't explain: genuine humility, authentic transformation, miraculous healings, and lives radically changed. Hardened journalists encountered God while covering revival meetings. One particularly cynical reporter from a major network, sent to do an exposé on the next religious con, attended a prayer gathering in Atlanta intending to reveal it as manipulation. Instead, she experienced a profound encounter with the presence of God that left her weeping on camera, later testifying publicly to her conversion. Similar stories emerged from media outlets across the country, skeptics becoming believers not through argument but through encounter. This revival, born from the ashes of scandal and watered by tears of repentance, became a turning point for America. It didn't fix all the nation's problems overnight, crime didn't disappear, political divisions didn't vanish, economic challenges remained, but it fundamentally shifted the spiritual atmosphere. Where there had been cynicism, hope emerged. Where there had been division, unity began to form around shared faith rather than shared politics. Where there had been compromise and lukewarm commitment, conviction returned. Churches began to look different. Worship became less about production and more about authentic encounter. Preaching became less about self-help and more about the gospel. Ministry became less about building organizations and more about serving people. Discipleship became the priority over attendance numbers. Character development replaced program development as the measure of success. The American church was being rebuilt on a more solid foundation, not on the sand of human personality and organizational success, but on the rock of Christ and His Word. It was painful transition, requiring the collapse of what was false to make room for what was true, but I saw that by the end of 2026, the church in America, though smaller and less visible, was stronger and more faithful than it had been in generations. After processing what I had seen concerning America, I reached for the scroll that represented Canada. As I unrolled it, new visions began to unfold. The first thing I witnessed for Canada was a major political upheaval that would result in a complete restructuring of national leadership. I saw evidence emerge of deep corruption within multiple levels of government: federal, provincial, and municipal. Financial scandals involving Chinese business interests came to light, revealing that policy decisions affecting national security had been influenced by foreign money. The exposures led to emergency elections and a shift toward leadership that prioritized Canadian sovereignty and traditional values. The second vision for Canada involved a spiritual awakening that began in Indigenous communities and spread outward. I watched as First Nations peoples experienced powerful moves of God that reconciled centuries of pain and injustice. Traditional tribal elders had encounters with Jesus Christ that honored their cultural identity while revealing the fullness of the gospel. This movement bridged the divide between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians in profound ways, bringing healing to relationships that had been fractured for generations. Churches across Canada began to embrace authentic reconciliation, not as a political program but as a spiritual mandate, and the result was a nationwide revival that emphasized justice, mercy, and humility. The scroll for South Africa revealed visions that were both troubling and hopeful. I saw escalating violence and social unrest that pushed the nation to the brink of civil conflict. Economic collapse created desperation, and old tribal and racial tensions threatened to tear the country apart. Infrastructure failures, particularly in electricity and water systems, created humanitarian crises in major cities. But in the midst of this chaos, I witnessed God raising up a new generation of leaders from unexpected places. Young believers from townships and rural areas began to demonstrate wisdom and authority that drew people from all backgrounds. They preached reconciliation with such power that ancient enemies embraced as brothers. Prayer movements erupted simultaneously across the nation, with millions gathering to intercede for South Africa's future. The breakthrough came through spiritual means, not political maneuvering, and the nation was pulled back from the edge of disaster by God's direct intervention. As I stood in that field holding additional scrolls for other nations, the Philippines, several European countries, nations in the Middle East and Asia, I heard a voice speak clearly, "Not yet. These you will reveal if and when I permit it. What you've seen is enough for now. Go and warn those I've shown you." The visions ended abruptly, and suddenly I was back at the cabin. I opened my eyes to see Aaron's face hovering over mine, tears streaming down his cheeks. Marcus, can you hear me? Stay with me." Paramedics were rushing up the steps with equipment. I'd been unconscious for nearly 12 minutes, they told me later. No pulse for most of that time. They couldn't explain why I was alive, let alone why I suffered no brain damage. But I know why I came back. I have a message to deliver, a warning to sound. The events I witnessed are not possibilities, they are certainties. God showed me what's coming so that those who have ears to hear can prepare, can pray, can position themselves for what lies ahead. I'm not asking you to believe me blindly. I'm asking you to watch. January 2026 is almost here. The signs will manifest. The prophecies will unfold. And when they do, remember that a soldier who had no reason to lie, who risks his reputation and career to share this message, tried to warn you. Share this testimony. Pray for wisdom and discernment. Prepare your heart for what's coming. And above all, draw close to God, because the days ahead will require faith like never before. The scroll has been unrolled. The message has been delivered. What you do with it is between you and the God who allowed you to hear it. May He grant you wisdom, courage, and peace in the days ahead.